So Bitcoin is pulling back again, and for the majority, this feels extremely uncomfortable. But when you actually take time to zoom out and look at the charts, something very important stands out. This move may in fact look scary, but it's definitely not random. On this chart, we're clearly in a manipulation phase where price is being drawn down, liquidity is getting taken, and weak hands are ultimately getting shaken out. But now zooming out, and when you line this up with the higher time frame chart on the monthly, you can see something critical. This manipulation is in fact occurring inside a macro uptrend. And on the monthly time frame, Bitcoin has been printing higher highs and higher low structure ever since late 2023. So this isn't a breakdown. This is manipulation inside an uptrend, pulling back to a higher low / critical level of support before likely continuing the trend higher. Now, before we go deeper into the charts, let's quickly look at the macro, because what's happening behind the scenes is actually very bullish. Spot Bitcoin ETFs keep absorbing the supply, and yesterday alone, the spot ETFs saw $457 million in net inflows. Now, this was led by Fidelity's FBTC, followed by BlackRock's IBIT, both with an accumulative amount of $457 million. Now, the total net inflows do currently sit at $112 billion in net assets, and this represents 6.57% of Bitcoin's market cap. This is not leverage. This isn't speculation. This is real capital buying real Bitcoin, which leads us over to a very important country, which is stating that they're publicly backing Bitcoin. Now, this is Bhutan, and Bhutan's government just said Bitcoin's strength lies in its ability to compound value over time. Country stacking BTC. It's here. That's a country openly acknowledging Bitcoin as long-term value. So countries aren't debating Bitcoin anymore. They're actually stacking it. Now, coming over to Bitcoin Finance, which is incredibly early, because according to Pantera Capital, only 1.4% of Bitcoin is deployed in BTCFi. Apps built on stacks like Alex Lab BTC and Zest Protocol are the ones driving the early growth. Now, the main translation is Bitcoin's utility is expanding and it's still highly under-allocated. Now, keep this in mind as we go through the charts, because looking at the monthly, let's zoom all the way back out again to the monthly chart here. This is the most important time frame. And what do we see? We have the higher highs and the higher lows. This is clean, bullish structure. Nothing here yet suggests a trend reversal. Pullbacks like this are how bull markets build the higher low formations. Now, when you combine this with the ETF inflows and governments openly stacking Bitcoin, this monthly structure starts to matter even more, which will now bring us over to our weekly time frame analysis. Now, dropping down to the weekly time frame, Bitcoin is sitting directly inside a major weekly support zone. In fact, this is a level that was previously acting as resistance and has now been turned into support. So we've initially created something called a flipped SR, where resistance has now turned into support. And this is exactly where you would expect buyers to step in during a healthy bear market. So price is respecting this area, which lines up perfectly with what we're seeing in the macro. Institutions and long-term players are still buying, whilst Bitcoin comes back down to a critical level of support. Now, if the bulls do step into gear here and we can hold between $80 to sort of high $70,000, then this is where we could see an initial run up back into the supply block, which currently sits at $95,000. And on the daily chart, it starts to get even clearer, because Bitcoin is sitting right on daily demand and we're already seeing reactions from this zone. In fact, for the last 4 days, we've had these strong buying wicks where the buyers are stepping back in this demand territory. And this tells us two things. Selling pressure is weakening into support and buyers are actively defending this level. If this daily support continues to hold, the next logical move, is a rotation back into supply. So we've currently come back down from this supply block into daily demand. And if the bulls can hold this territory, then it does look like we could see a push back up to 95K. Now, when it comes to the lower time frames, we're looking at the 2 hour here for Bitcoin. This is where we start to see the base building out, and is usually where the market absorbs a lot of the sell pressure. It shakes out the weak hands and builds a foundation for the next move. And, this ultimately lines up with the macro backdrop. We've got whales accumulating, massive net inflows for Bitcoin, whilst it sits back down in lower time frame demand from the lows back in early December. And we also have this demand territory at 80K if we do see a sweep below. So we are sort of running back into supply and then pulling back down into critical demand areas where in the past we have seen massive relief rallies. So if the bulls do step into gear here and we can hold this demand zone, then it looks like we could be imminently pushing back into supply at $95,000. However, if we do lose this demand zone, then there is also liquidity pockets below in the low 80K territory, which brings us back down to the lows from mid to late November. Key things to take away on the LTF. We are currently in an area where previous bounces have occurred in December, but losing this demand zone would only mean liquidity pockets way below in the 80K territory. Now, this lines up with the macro backdrop, doesn't it? Because you don't typically see aggressive ETF inflows and government level adoption during this sort of behavior, or at market tops, let's say, for example. So when you put this all together, the monthly trend is still bullish. We have higher highs and higher low structures and have come back down to a massive weekly demand territory. The daily is showing a strong reaction from the demand territory. The lower time frames indicate consolidation and not collapse. And as always, we should ignore the noise, respect the structure, and let the market confirm the next move. Now, if you want to support the channel, the links below are there for you. Trade on the platform we use every day and get your fee discounts and bonuses. Now, it is completely optional, but it really helps the channel grow. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next update.